Believing the only enemy a soldier faces is the one in another uniform is the most dangerous mistake one can make. The true horrors are not found in the bright, deafening chaos of the battlefield, but in the suffocating silence that follows. I speak of the things that fester in the quiet moments, the watch at 3 in the morning, when the darkness feels ancient and alive, the palpable dread that hangs in the air of a freshly abandoned village, the reflection in a darkened window that is not quite your own. These are not stories of war. They are hymns to the fear that wears a soldier's face, but answers to a much older, much darker name. I have heard the whispers carried on the gunpowder wind, confessions from men who saw more than they were ever meant to, and I am here to share those burdens with you. The first vision I will share begins not with a bang, but with a chilling, unnatural quiet. Imagine a jungle so dense that sunlight is a forgotten myth, a place where the air is thick and wet, like breathing in water. A patrol of 5 men, little more than boys dressed in green, moved through this primordial labyrinth. They were hunting for an enemy they could shoot, an enemy of flesh and blood, but the jungle was hunting them with something far worse: silence. The normal cacophony of insects and animals had ceased, replaced by a profound emptiness that pressed in on them, a vacuum that stole the air from their lungs and the courage from their hearts. It was a silence that felt intelligent, predatory, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for them to make one final mistake. One of the soldiers, a corporal named Reyes, felt it first, a creeping sensation on the back of his neck, the kind of primal warning that screams of unseen eyes. He would see movement in his periphery, a flicker of shadow that vanished when he turned his head. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, a trick of the light in the suffocating gloom. But then came the whispers. They weren't in any language he knew. They were sibilant, ancient sounds that seemed to emanate from the rotting earth itself. They coiled around his thoughts, tasting of decay and madness. He saw the faces of his comrades begin to change, their features subtly twisting in the green-tinged darkness, their eyes reflecting a fear that was not their own. The jungle had found a crack in his sanity and was beginning to pour its poison inside. This place, they later learned from a terrified local guide they found cowering in a nearby village, was known as the throat of the Serpent. It was a patch of land considered eternally cursed, a place where the veil between worlds is thin and torn. The guide spoke of an entity, neither ghost nor demon, that fed on the fear of those who trespassed. It didn't kill with claws or teeth. It unraveled the mind thread by thread, until its victims turned on each other, or simply walked into the deepest, darkest parts of the jungle, never to be seen again. The whispers Reyes heard were the echoes of its past meals, the psychic residue of countless soldiers from countless wars who had lost their minds in that very spot. The patrol was not just walking through a forest, they were walking through the belly of a forgotten god. The breaking point came during a sudden torrential downpour. The sky opened, and rain fell not like water, but like shards of black glass. In the flashes of lightning, Reyes saw it clearly. Standing among the trees was a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its form composed of shifting leaves, mud, and writhing insects. It had no face, only a sense of profound ancient malevolence that struck him like a physical blow. It didn't move. It simply was, and in that moment of pure, undiluted terror, Reyes understood. The enemy wasn't a man. It was the place itself. It was the accumulated hatred of the land, given form by the endless river of blood that had been spilled upon it, and it was hungry. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Now, let us leave the suffocating green hell of the jungle and travel to a different kind of abyss, the endless ochre expanse of the desert. Here, the enemy is not the cloying darkness, but the blinding, indifferent light. The heat bakes sanity away, and the horizon plays cruel tricks on the mind. A small reconnaissance unit was stationed at a remote outpost, a forgotten speck of dust and corrugated metal named Outpost Echo. It was a place where careers went to die, a punishment assignment for the disgraced and the disobedient. The men there were already ghosts, haunted by their pasts long before the desert began to whisper its own terrifying secrets. They thought their enemy was the boredom, the crushing isolation. They were wrong. The desert was listening. The phenomenon began subtly. Equipment would malfunction in bizarre ways. Radios would emit bursts of static that sounded eerily like human screams. Compasses would spin wildly, not as if broken, but as if searching for a pole that no longer existed. Not the typical shimmering pools of water, but vivid, detailed visions. Men would see entire battalions marching on the horizon, only for them to dissolve into heat haze upon closer inspection. They saw cities of black glass rise from the dunes and crumble into dust in the blink of an eye. The base doctor called it mass hysteria, a psychological consequence of extreme isolation and heat. But one soldier, a grizzled sergeant named Marcus, knew better. He had seen the figures in the mirages, and they were wearing uniforms from a war that had ended 50 years ago. Marcus began keeping a secret journal, documenting the escalating strangeness. He wrote of the sand whispers, a low humming that seemed to emanate from beneath the very foundations of the outpost at night. He described how the sand itself would sometimes shift into intricate, unsettling patterns when no wind was blowing, patterns that resembled broken crosses and serpentine symbols. He noted how the men were changing. Their conversations grew sparse, their eyes became vacant, and they would spend hours staring out into the empty desert, as if waiting for an appointment they couldn't remember making. The isolation wasn't driving them mad. Something was actively trying to communicate, something ancient and patient that had been buried under the sand, waiting for new minds to inhabit. The truth, buried in a long-forgotten supply crate, was a single leather-bound diary from the outpost's original commanding officer, dating back to the 1950s. The entries described the same phenomena: the impossible mirages, the whispers from the earth, the creeping madness. The officer wrote about a geological anomaly his team had discovered during construction, a massive, perfectly smooth obsidian stone, buried deep beneath the outpost. He believed it was a psychic amplifier, a listening post for some non-human intelligence. The last entry was a frantic, terrifying scrawl. It knows our names. It shows us our deaths in the heat. God forgive us. We woke it up. It sings of the cold ashes of forgotten stars. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Marcus found the diary too late. One night, the sand whispers rose to a deafening roar. Every man on the base walked out into the desert in a trance, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Marcus, barricaded in his room, watched through a crack in the door as they marched in perfect formation towards a shimmering mirage, a city of black glass that this time did not disappear. It seemed to welcome them, swallowing them into its impossible architecture before vanishing, leaving only the pristine, indifferent sand. When the relief convoy arrived weeks later, they found the outpost completely empty, save for one man, Marcus, now white-haired and catatonic, muttering a single phrase over and over. They answered the call. They answered the call of the silent king. Let the desert sands settle, and turn your gaze now to the cold, sterile geometry of a military barracks, a place of order, discipline, and routine. But beneath the polished floors and neatly made beds, shadows linger. Not all casualties happen on the battlefield. Some souls become so entwined with a place that they refuse to leave, even after their hearts have stopped beating. At Fort McClellan, there was one such soul, a presence so palpable and malevolent that an entire wing of the barracks was eventually sealed off. They called him the Inspector, the ghost of a drill sergeant from the Vietnam era, a man named Elias Thorne, who was known for his sadistic cruelty and his obsession with perfection. Sergeant Thorne hadn't died in combat. He had taken his own life in his office at the end of the hall, after being formally accused of causing the training death of a young recruit. His suicide was an act not of remorse, but of pure, undiluted spite. He believed he was being punished for upholding the very standards the Army demanded, and so he remained, his spirit, forever bound to the site of his final bitter failure, continued his work from beyond the grave. New recruits sleeping in those barracks would be violently awakened in the dead of night, the feeling of icy fingers gripping their ankles, their blankets torn from their beds and thrown across the room, landing in a perfectly folded triangle. The scent of stale cigar smoke and wintergreen would hang heavy in the air. The activity was never random. It was always focused on those Thorne's spirit deemed unworthy. A soldier who failed a rifle inspection would find their weapon disassembled and scattered, the pieces arranged in a spiral pattern on their bed. A recruit who was caught with a wrinkled uniform would open their footlocker to find every piece of clothing inside shredded, as if by a madman with a bayonet. But the most terrifying manifestation was his voice, a low guttural whisper that would echo from the empty hallway, calling out their names, listing their failures, their weaknesses, their deepest insecurities. It was a voice that stripped them bare, that dismantled their confidence and left them as trembling, broken husks. It was psychological warfare waged by the damned. One young private, a boy named Simmons, decided to defy the ghost. He was a bookish, quiet kid, the kind Thorne would have despised in life. Hearing the stories, Simmons thought it was just a legend to scare new recruits. One night, he stood in the middle of the hallway and shouted, "You're not real, you're just a story." The air immediately dropped 20 degrees. The doors down the hall began to slam open and shut in a violent, escalating rhythm. A sound like 1,000 nails being dragged across a chalkboard erupted from Thorne's old office. Simmons stood his ground, terrified but resolute, and that is when he saw it, a reflection in the polished floor, a distorted image of a man in an old uniform, his face a mask of pure rage, his mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. The final straw for the base command came when Simmons was found the next morning. He was alive, but his mind was gone. He was huddled in the corner of the hallway, his eyes wide and unseeing, his hands obsessively polishing his boots over and over again, until his fingers were raw and bleeding. He never spoke another coherent word. The wing was officially condemned, the doors welded shut, the windows bricked over, but to this day, soldiers on the base report hearing it, late at night, when the wind is just right, a faint, muffled voice from behind the brick wall, still calling out names, still inspecting his troops, forever demanding a perfection that can only be found in the grave. The darkness remembers those who serve it. Now, we move from a single, vengeful spirit to a contagion of fear, an echo of trauma so powerful it infects the very ground it touches. Consider a field hospital in a war-torn country, a place saturated with the essence of pain, desperation, and sudden violent death. This wasn't a building of brick and mortar, but a sprawling complex of tents and temporary structures, a place where the living and the dying were separated only by a thin sheet of canvas. The doctors and nurses there were heroes, fighting a losing war against mortality itself. But they soon discovered that the wounds they couldn't see were the ones that would fester and spread, creating an unseen spiritual epidemic. It started with the children. Local children, orphaned by the conflict, would often play near the camp's perimeter. They began talking about the whispering soldiers' figures they would see standing just beyond the fence line at dusk. They described men in tattered, outdated uniforms, their faces obscured by shadow, who never spoke aloud but whose voices they could hear inside their heads. The soldiers on guard duty dismissed it as the fantasy of traumatized kids. They stopped dismissing it when they started seeing the figures themselves. They appeared for only a moment, shimmering in the heat haze of the setting sun before vanishing. They left no footprints, made no sound, but their presence left behind a palpable chill, a feeling of profound and inconsolable sadness. The nurses were the next to experience it. They would be in the middle of treating a patient when they would hear a faint, desperate whisper right beside their ear, begging for more time or one last letter home. They would turn to find no one there. Patients, delirious with fever and pain, would speak to people who weren't in the tent. Conversations with comrades who had died weeks or even months earlier. They would describe in lucid detail the exact circumstances of their friends' deaths, things they had no possible way of knowing. It was as if the spirits of the fallen were drawn to this nexus of suffering, seeking a final moment of connection, a last chance to unburden their souls before being dragged into the ABS. A chaplain at the hospital, a man named Father Michael, believed he understood what was happening. He wasn't dealing with individual ghosts, but with a psychic scar on the landscape. The sheer concentration of violent death had created a permanent echo, a loop of trauma that replayed itself over and over. The whispering soldiers were not conscious entities. They were fragments of dying moments, imprinted on the environment like a photograph on film. They were drawn to the living, not out of malice, but out of a desperate spiritual instinct, like a moth to a flame, trying to remember what it felt like to be alive, even for a second. The hospital wasn't just healing bodies, it was a lighthouse for the lost. The climax arrived on the anniversary of a particularly brutal battle that had occurred on that very ground years before. As night fell, the entire camp was engulfed in a phantom cacophony. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screaming men erupted from the empty fields around them. The spectral figures of the whispering soldiers appeared not as faint shimmers, but as solid, terrifying apparitions, running, fighting, and dying all around the terrified staff and patients. They were entirely oblivious to the living, trapped in their final horrifying moments. Father Michael walked out into the middle of this spectral chaos, holding his broken cross, and began to pray. He didn't pray for them to leave. He prayed for them to find peace. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? From the echoes of the past, we now turn to a premonition of the future, a curse that feels like a gift. There are some soldiers who carry a unique and terrible burden, an inexplicable sensitivity to the threads of fate. They are the ones who know, with absolute certainty, when death is about to visit their comrades. In a platoon serving in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, there was a young man named Corporal Evan Reed. He was a good soldier, reliable and brave, but his squad mates kept their distance. They were unnerved by his eyes. Sometimes, when he looked at one of them, his gaze would fill with a deep, sorrowful pity, as if he were looking at a man already dead. They called him the Crowd, for where he looked, misfortune was sure to follow. Evan's curse had manifested during his first tour. He had looked at his best friend during a morning briefing, and had suddenly seen him not as he was, but as a corpse, his face pale and his uniform stained with dried blood. The vision was so powerful, so real, that Evan felt sick. He tried to warn his friend, making up an excuse for him to stay back from the patrol. His friend laughed it off. 3 hours later, he was killed by a roadside bomb, in the exact manner Evan had foreseen. From that day on, the visions came for others. It was never a choice. He would look at a fellow soldier and see their final moment, a cracked mirror reflecting a future that was already written in stone. He never spoke of his visions again, but the others knew. They could feel it. If Evan avoided eye contact with you for a day, a wave of relief would wash over the platoon. If he suddenly started being kind to you, sharing his rations or taking your watch, a quiet terror would set in. They knew he was trying to offer a small final comfort. He was a walking, talking omen. The burden was destroying him. He saw the deaths of men he respected, men he considered brothers, and was powerless to stop them. He lived in a constant state of anticipatory grief, mourning men who were still alive, trapped in a lonely hell of foresight. He was the witness to their last breath, long before they ever drew it. The platoon's psychologist diagnosed him with severe PTSD, attributing his visions to hypervigilance and anxiety. But Evan knew better. He could feel the cold hand of something else at play. He felt as though he had been chosen, marked by some morbid entity that fed on the inevitability of death. He would dream of a vast, dark bird with wings made of shadow, its eyes cold points of light like distant stars. In the dreams, the bird would whisper the names of the next to fall, and he would wake up with the name on his lips like a prayer of the damned. His curse was not a product of his mind. It was a connection to a cosmic, predatory indifference. The breaking point for Evan came when he looked at his own reflection in a shard of a broken mirror. For the first time, he saw his own death. He saw himself, alone, on a rocky outcrop, not killed by the enemy, but turning his own rifle on himself, unable to bear the weight of his terrible knowledge any longer. The vision was peaceful, a release. He saw the date, the time. He had 1 week. He spent his final days writing letters, not just to his family, but to the families of the men he knew were going to die after him. Letters to be delivered by a trusted friend. He described their bravery, their final thoughts, things he couldn't possibly know but wrote with absolute certainty. On the prophesied day, he walked to the outcrop, a man not taking his life, but finally silencing the whispers. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Let us now descend from the mountains and into the cold, crushing depths of the ocean. The claustrophobic steel hull of a submarine is a world unto itself, a pocket of fragile life, suspended in an alien environment of absolute darkness and immense pressure. Here, the mind can be a greater enemy than any torpedo. The crew of the USS Hesperus, an old Cold War-era nuclear submarine, knew this all too well. They were on a long-term stealth patrol in the North Atlantic, a mission defined by endless silence and nerve-shredding tension. But the silence aboard the Hesperus was not empty. It was filled with something else, an unseen presence that the crew came to call the Creeper. It began with sounds. In the dead of night, during the loneliest hours of the watch, sailors would hear a soft, wet, dragging sound from the empty corridors. It sounded like something heavy and sodden being pulled along the metal floor. Patrols would find trails of seawater in sections of the sub that were perfectly dry. Trails that would begin in the middle of a hallway and end abruptly at a solid steel bulkhead. Men would feel a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature in certain areas, their breath misting before them, a cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. The sub's sensitive acoustic sensors would occasionally pick up a sound from inside the hull, a low, guttural murmur that the computer could not identify. The legend among the crew was that it was the ghost of a sailor who had been lost at sea during a brutal storm decades earlier. His body was never recovered. They said his waterlogged spirit had latched onto the submarine, a vessel from his own navy, and had followed it down into the eternal dark. He wasn't malevolent, they whispered, just lost and confused, endlessly searching the corridors for his bunk, for his shipmates, for a way back to a world he no longer belonged to. But this comforting story began to fall apart as the encounters grew more personal. Men would wake up gasping, with the distinct feeling of wet, cold hands on their faces. the scent of brine and decay filling their small bunks. A young sonar technician named Wells was the most affected. He was a sensitive, introverted man, and the presence seemed drawn to him. He started having nightmares of drowning, of being crushed by unimaginable pressure in an abyss of freezing water. During his watch, he would see a face in his sonar display, a distorted, waterlogged human face coalescing from the static for just a second before vanishing. He claimed it was trying to speak to him, that its whispers were just below the threshold of his hearing, promising him the peace of the deep. His superiors saw a man cracking under pressure, a danger to the mission. They confined him to his quarters, a decision that would prove to be fatal. One night, the entire submarine was jolted by a horrific, grinding screech that echoed through the hull. The emergency alarms blared. When the damage control team forced their way into Wells's sealed quarters, they found the room empty. That was impossible. The room was sealed from the outside, but what they found was worse than an impossible escape. The thick, reinforced glass of the room's single porthole was shattered outward, as if something from inside the room had forced its way out into the crushing, deadly pressure of the deep ocean. On the floor, a trail of seawater led from Wells's bunk to the broken porthole. The creeper had not been a ghost trying to get in. It had been a lure, a siren's call from the abyss, and it had finally claimed a new soul for its lonely kingdom. From the crushing pressure of the deep, we rise to the thin, cold air of the skies. A pilot is a master of his domain, a creature of logic and precision, trusting his instruments and his training above all else. But what happens when the instruments lie? What happens when the voice in your headset is not your controller? For the pilots of a squadron of night bombers stationed at a remote airbase in England during World War II, the sky itself became a source of supernatural dread. They were haunted by what they called the phantom signal, a mysterious radio broadcast that would cut through the static on their long flights over enemy territory, a broadcast that spelled doom for all who heard it. The signal was always the same. It would override their secure channels with terrifying clarity. First would come the faint sound of a young woman humming a lullaby, a haunting, melancholic tune that would make the blood run cold. Then, a calm, gentle female voice would speak in perfect, unaccented English. She would call the pilot by his name. She would tell him she was waiting for him. She would describe with serene accuracy the exact way he was about to die. "Don't worry, David," the voice might whisper. "The flak will be quick. You won't feel a thing." Or "The engine fire is so pretty, Michael, like a falling star, just for me." Every single pilot who reported hearing the voice never returned from their mission. The Royal Air Force Command investigated, of course. They suspected it was a new form of German psychological warfare, a black propaganda broadcast designed to shatter pilot morale. They swept the airwaves, trying to triangulate the signal's source, but they found nothing. The signal had no point of origin. It didn't seem to be a broadcast at all, but something that was generated spontaneously inside the pilot's own radio set. It was a ghost in the machine, a voice from the ether itself. The lullaby became a death knell. Pilots grew more terrified of the silence on the radio than they were of the enemy fighters or the anti-aircraft guns. The silence meant the voice could come at any moment. One pilot, a hardened veteran named Arthur, decided to fight back. He was a rational man who refused to believe in ghosts or curses. On his next flight, as he flew over the dark expanse of the English Channel, the lullaby began to fade in. The voice whispered his name. "Arthur, it's a long way to fall, but the water is soft. I'll be there to catch you." Instead of panicking, Arthur gripped his microphone. He began to talk back to the voice. He told her about his wife, his son, the garden he was planning to build when he got home. He spoke of life, of love, of everything he had to live for. He screamed at her, cursed her, told her she had no power over him. For the first time, the voice's calm demeanor broke. It shrieked, a sound of pure static and rage that nearly blew out Arthur's eardrums. And then, silence. Arthur completed his mission and returned to base, shaken but alive, the first man ever to have heard the voice and survived. He believed he had conquered it. But that night, as he slept, he was plagued by a nightmare. He saw a ghostly woman in a white dress, her face a blur, standing at the end of the runway. She was humming her lullaby and beckoning to him. He woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, Arthur's plane, which had been perfectly serviced, suffered a catastrophic engine failure during takeoff. It crashed at the end of the runway, in the exact spot where he had seen the woman in his dream. He hadn't beaten her, he had only injured her. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let us now turn our attention to the cold, unforgiving theater of urban warfare. A city under siege is a labyrinth of concrete and shattered lives, where every corner can hide an enemy, and every shadow can feel like a threat. In the ruins of a city that will remain nameless, a squad of Special Forces soldiers was tasked with clearing a district, block by block. It was grueling, soul-crushing work, but in this particular city, they found an enemy that wasn't on their intelligence reports. The locals called it the Collector of Faces, a spectral entity that haunted the bombed-out shells of buildings, a creature born from the city's collective agony. The first strange occurrence was the graffiti. In buildings that had been confirmed as empty for months, they would find fresh, disturbing artwork on the walls. It wasn't spray paint or chalk. It looked as if it had been drawn with charcoal or ash. The drawings were always of faces, hundreds of them, overlapping and screaming in silent agony. They were incredibly detailed, each one unique, each one a portrait of terror. The soldiers tried to dismiss it as the work of a deranged scavenger, but the new faces would appear in rooms they had just cleared and secured, sometimes just minutes after they had passed through. It was as if the walls themselves were bleeding, these images of despair. Then, the soldiers started seeing it. A flicker of movement in a shattered window, a fleeting shape darting through the rubble. It was vaguely humanoid but moved with an unnatural, skittering speed. Its most terrifying feature, however, was its face or lack thereof. It was a smooth, blank canvas of pale skin, utterly devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. It was a void. They soon realized its purpose. It was hunting, not for their lives, but for their identities. A soldier would become separated from the squad for only a moment, and when they found him, he would be in a catatonic state, his eyes empty, his mind wiped clean. He would not recognize his friends, his own name, or even his own reflection. He was a hollow shell. The squad's medic, a woman named Anya, was the one who pieced it together. She noticed that after each soldier was hollowed, a new, perfectly rendered face would appear on the wall of a nearby building. It was the face of their lost comrade, captured in the last moment of his terror. The creature was literally stealing their faces, their memories, their souls, and adding them to its ghastly collection. It was a psychic vampire, feeding on the very essence of who they were. The city's pain had given birth to a monster that sought to erase the identities of its invaders, to make them as nameless and forgotten as the rubble they walked upon. The squad was finally cornered in the ruins of an old library. The collector, growing bolder, began to phase through the walls, its blank face a terrifying mockery of humanity. Anya, remembering a local legend she'd been told, realized their weapons were useless. The creature wasn't truly physical. She ordered her men to take out their personal effects, photos of family, letters, anything that tied them to their lives, their identities. They held them up, shouting their names, their serial numbers, their hometowns. They screamed their memories into the darkness, reinforcing who they were. The collector recoiled, screeching in agony, as if burned by the sheer force of their individuality. It dissolved into a cloud of ash and shadow, and the faces on the walls faded into nothingness, finally at peace. They had survived, but they knew the collector was still out there waiting for new faces to add to its gallery of the forgotten. Now we must speak of the weapons. A soldier trusts his rifle, his blade, the tools of his trade. But some weapons acquire a history, a soul of their own. They become soaked in the blood and violence they have created. And sometimes, something dark takes root within the cold steel. There is a legend in certain circles of the Marine Corps, a whispered tale of a particular K-bar knife, known only as the Thirst. It was an old, battered blade, its hilt wrapped in worn leather, but its edge remained impossibly sharp, no matter how much it was used. The knife would appear mysteriously in the gear of a random Marine before a major engagement, and whoever carried it would become an unstoppable, terrifying force on the battlefield. The Marine who possessed the Thirst would feel no fear, no hesitation. He would move with a preternatural speed and ferocity, fighting with the rage of a berserker. His comrades would watch in awe and horror as he carved a path through the enemy, the old knife a blur of silver in his hand. He would survive impossible odds, taking down dozens of foes single-handedly, seemingly immune to bullets and explosions. He would be hailed as a hero, a legend, but the glory came at a terrible price. Once the battle was over, once the bloodlust had faded, the Marine would be changed. The light in his eyes would be gone, replaced by a cold, empty hunger. The change was always the same. The man would become withdrawn, silent, prone to fits of sudden explosive violence over the smallest slight. He would spend hours alone, just cleaning the knife, polishing it, talking to it in low whispers. He would begin to lose his memory of the battle, the details of his heroism becoming a blur. All he could remember was the thirst, a terrible, gnawing thirst for violence, for blood, that the knife in his hand seemed to demand from him. The knife wasn't just a weapon, it was a parasite. It fed its wielder with supernatural prowess in combat, and in return, it consumed his soul, leaving behind an empty vessel filled with nothing but rage. The legend told of the knife's origin. It was said to have been forged by a blacksmith who had sold his soul to a war demon, quenching the blade in the blood of his own family. The demon was bound to the steel, and the knife was cursed to seek out conflict, to pass from hand to hand, from war to war, feeding on the chaos and bloodshed, growing stronger with every life it took. The heroes it created were merely its puppets, temporary hosts that it would burn out and discard once their capacity for violence was exhausted. The knife would then disappear from the broken Marine's gear, only to reappear in the kit of another young, ambitious soldier before the next battle, ready to begin the cycle anew. One Marine, a sergeant who had witnessed the curse of the thirst to destroy 3 of his men over 2 tours, decided to end it. When the knife appeared in the gear of a young private he had sworn to protect, the sergeant confronted the boy. He didn't try to take the knife by force. Instead, he told the private the stories of the men who had carried it before, of the empty shells they had become. He offered the boy a choice: be a temporary celebrated monster, or remain a man. The private, terrified, handed over the knife. The sergeant took the cursed blade, walked to the base's forge, and with a prayer on his lips, melted it down in the white-hot fire until it was nothing but a lump of slag. As the blade melted, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the workshop, a sound that was not human. He had broken the curse, but that night, he dreamt of a thirst that could never be quenched. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Let the fire of the forge die down to cold ashes, and let us now speak of the battlefield itself. Long after the fighting has stopped, and the bodies have been cleared, the land remembers. It holds onto the echoes of pain and rage, replaying them for those sensitive enough to listen. There is a place in northern France, a section of the old World War I trenches near the Somme, that is known to locals as the Weeping Field. It is a place of profound and unending sorrow. During the day, it is a quiet, grassy expanse, scarred by the gentle depressions of the old trenches. But at night, especially on a moonless, misty night, the field comes alive with the ghosts of 1916. It is not a place of violent apparitions or malevolent spirits. It is a place of pure, unadulterated grief. Visitors who dare to walk the old trench lines after dark report being overcome by waves of inexplicable sadness, a sorrow so deep and crushing it brings them to their knees. They hear the sounds not of battle, but of its aftermath, the soft, desperate weeping of dying men, the faint whispers for mothers and sweethearts, the gasping breaths of soldiers succumbing to poison gas. These are not frightening sounds, they are heartbreaking. It is the sound of 1,000,000 young lives being extinguished, an auditory scar that time has failed to heal. The most common sighting is that of the lantern carrier, a lone figure, described as a young soldier in a tattered British uniform, is seen walking slowly along the edge of the trench. He carries an old trench lantern, its dim, flickering light cutting through the mist. He never looks at any observers. He simply walks, peering down into the darkness of the trench, as if searching for a fallen comrade. His shoulders are slumped, his movements heavy with an exhaustion that transcends time. Those who have seen him report feeling not fear, but a wave of immense pity. He is a phantom trapped not by anger, but by a sense of duty and loss that has bound him to this piece of earth for over a century. A team of paranormal investigators decided to spend a night in the Weeping Field, armed with audio recorders and thermal cameras. They recorded clear electronic voice phenomena, capturing dozens of faint voices whispering names, regimental numbers, and broken phrases like "I'm so cold" and "tell them I was brave." Their thermal cameras captured something even more unsettling. As the mist rolled in, they filmed dozens of cold spots appearing all around them. They were the size and shape of human bodies, lying in the grass in the exact positions men would have fallen during a charge over the top. The field was still littered with the spectral corpses of the slain, their cold, spiritual energy the source of the land's unending sorrow. The investigation's most profound moment came near dawn. The team was packing up when they all heard it, not on a recorder but with their own ears. A single clear voice rising from the trench in front of them. It was a young man's voice, singing a few lines of an old music hall song, his voice filled with a cheerful, heartbreaking innocence. It was a ghost, not of a man's death, but of his life, a fleeting memory of a moment of happiness before the slaughter. In that moment, the investigators understood. The Weeping Field wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the lives that were never lived, the futures that were stolen. It was a memorial made of pure, eternal grief. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you?